And we're going to find out really what you want to do with your life.
What I want to do with my life, I want to live it. That's it. That's the beginning and end of my final definitive statement about living. I want to live my life. If I can do that satisfactorily, I'll be a happy person.
Shakespeare and me, what's it going to be about?
It's going to be about my friendship with Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And the things we've shared together.
Yeah.
The great triumphs we've had together and the great failures we've had together. But the important thing is together.
When did you meet him?
Well, I don't like to talk about it. I
was
met him
it
35 years ago.
Was it in Stratford or?
No, it wasn't in Stratford.
South Bank, or where was it?
It was in the South Bank, actually. I went over there and walked around the area where he lived and worked and where the Globe was. And he greeted me. He was very kind and very thoughtful, and we had a very long, meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm. Shakespeare was an Elizabethan playwright, and presumably the greatest playwright who ever lived. He and I were old friends. He talked to me a lot. Shared his needs, his concerns, and even some of his poetry, because he wanted it to say, to live or not to live, that is the question. I said, no, Will. It's not about living, it's about being. And he said, my goodness, that's a good idea. And so he changed it to be or not to be. And he said, I was going to say, that's my concern. I said, no, don't say that. Because it's a question, isn't it? He said, well, yeah, I guess it is. I said, to be or not to be, that is the question. And he looked at me and said, what would I do without you? And so I've never been without him my whole life. At least my whole adult life. Maybe in my young life too, I don't know. What happens now?
When you take this idea of Shakespeare, the playwright, and his plays, into the classroom, how do you begin?
I usually begin by trying to make the bridge immediately between Shakespeare, the genius, and Shakespeare, the man, to indicate that really what he wrote was not convoluted. It actually is fairly clear, even though there are libraries devoted to interpreting him. On the other hand, if you say to be or not to be, that is the question, use the most famous example. It sounds like that's clear and simple enough. But then if you say, really, what does be mean? To be or not to be, since he doesn't say to live or not to live, to die or not to die. You can spend a semester on that, because all of us have different interpretations of what the word being really is. And so I think Shakespeare did too. It's one of the reasons why you can study Shakespeare your whole life, as I have essentially, direct him my whole artistic life, and still not come to a final understanding of what he meant. There are all various interpretations of what you think he meant. And that's why you do Hamlet again and again and again. I've done Hamlet 4 times, and I haven't come anywhere near to the end of understanding the play. So I keep working on it, and it's a great joy to do that. Because as I grow older, and hopefully wiser, more of the play opens to me, and that's what I think a masterpiece is. That is, the wiser and deeper you get as a human being, the more the work is available to you. So what I knew when I was in college about Hamlet is almost laughable in terms of what I think I know about that play now. And in 20 years, if I live that long, I will laugh at what I know now. Right, there are more Shakespeare festivals in the United States, Shakespeare theaters in the United States, than there are in England. And I think the reason for that is that when Shakespeare was working, England was not the same place it was now. In other words, Shakespearean English is much more natural to Americans than it is, I think, to the Brit. The Brits do Shakespeare in an English dialect that is natural to the Isles. But in fact, in its original form, Shakespeare sounded much more like American English than it did, as far as we know, than it does in British BBC English. It was rougher, cruder. You got to remember that when Shakespeare was played to audiences, it was like the equivalent of playing to a ball game audience here in the States. They were not polite, they were crude, they jumped, they yelled, they commented on what was going on stage, they left, they came back. It's much more akin to an athletic event in the United States than it is to a polite Broadway audience. I first started the Shakespeare Festival because I went out to Miller Theater in Herman Park, which is a huge area like Central Park in New York. And there's a theater that was built in the park primarily for music, ballet and symphony and so on. But I thought it was a perfect venue for doing Shakespeare, which is the size of Beethoven. And so when I went out to the park and saw that 1,700 seats could be filled, and then a hill beyond that where others could sit and watch, I thought it was very closely the equivalent of what Shakespeare had when he had the Globe, where people stood in the pit, and we think the audiences were somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 as far as we know. It was very close to what we have at Miller. People kept saying to me, no one will come out to Miller to see Shakespeare, they'll come out to see other events. And I didn't believe that, because if Shakespeare could attract thousands in his day, I didn't see why that couldn't happen in our day. And so I started, that was called Berger's Folly when we first began it. And the first audience we had was over 5,000. And we've had up to 15,000 at single performances of Shakespeare plays, which unfortunately in this country are frequently taught to students in a way that is boring and not as exciting as I think these plays literally are, because he was writing for the average man on the street, not for dukes and duchesses and princes, but for the average man and woman on the street. So that was my aim, to try to create a festival that would appeal to everyone, from 8-year-old boys and girls to 60 and 70-year-old adults. And I think we've been pretty successful. I think we're going into our, 33rd year or something like that. I lost count. Of working out there, and everyone predicted it would be a total failure. Nobody would come out to see it. And we've proved them wrong.
So what do you think the attraction is?
I think the attraction is exactly the same as it was in Shakespeare's day. Meaning that when Americans think of going to the theater, first of all, they think of Broadway. And Broadway is meant almost exclusively to entertain. Nothing wrong with that. But when we're dealing with the journey of our lives and where we're going and why we're there and so on, Shakespeare addresses those issues. American playwrights, and to a great extent English playwrights as well, don't address those issues because they're terrified of getting audiences that want to come and see those things. I think my colleagues and myself have proven that people really want to address those major dominant issues of their lives: life, death, love, marriage, etc. It's one thing if you have an audience, say out at the park where we perform, of 500 to 1,000. But when you have 15 to 17,000 at a single performance, you are addressing something they need and want to hear about. And Shakespeare does that in the most articulate way that one can possibly conceive of. In other words, the misconception that Shakespeare is addressing people of great intellect. And yet, let's go back to that famous soliloquy, which, by the way, is not a soliloquy. He's talking to the audience. It's a dialogue. And you say to be or not to be, that is the question. And you say, well, what does that mean? It means exactly what it says. To be? Well, what does be mean? I don't know. To be alive, to be married, to have children, to be part of the world you live. Who knows? But all of those are possible and conceivable. Depends on what the production thinks it means. But he doesn't say to live or not to live. He says to be. And so you can spend God knows how long trying to figure out what the word be means. But Shakespeare didn't have an education course in the Globe originally. Those people understood what he meant. Now, maybe they didn't understand all the reverberations of some of the words, but they understood the words as they were living their lives, whether they were butchers, bakers, princes, or whoever. And that's the genius of Shakespeare, that he appeals to almost every level of life as it is lived.
Okay, the next part of this is going to be then how does that equate and how does that relate to students who would come to your class? I mean, is the popularity of Shakespeare as it is in the park with 15,000 people,
Yeah.
how does that relate to people who
Well,
come?
I think what one has to do, I'm not patting myself on the back as a great teacher of Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare and I love teaching it. And I think what happens, the one example that shines out is I had a young lady who had never done Shakespeare in her life, a young actress. And she did the to be soliloquy and she started crying all the way through. So I let her finish. She cried to the end of the soliloquy and I asked her then why she was crying. And she said the most wonderful thing. She said, I've never had the words before. Well, that means a great deal. In other words, for what she felt, for what she thought about, for what was in her unconscious being, she could never articulate that. And then Shakespeare said, try these words. And they said exactly the way she felt. That's what I think Shakespeare does. He gives you the words. So for what you cannot articulate, for what traumas and griefs and hungers you feel in your own life, he gives you the words.
A number, but one of my great favorites is Macbeth's. When he does tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creep in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out brief candle, life's but a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
That's from what? What play is that? What play is that?
Macbeth. Just before the final battle in which he's killed. It's one of the most extraordinary speeches ever written and says so much.
Say it again.
Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creep in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, brief candle. Life's but a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.